We're getting some of the official vehicles coming onto the airport tarmac there, and we await the arrival of the president. It looks like they will be pulling up momentarily now, so we'll watch this. And as we conclude what has been a pretty extraordinary two-day summit where we saw I think inarguably, the two most powerful leaders in the world, President Xi and President Trump, exchange a lot of very nice words together. We see the silhouette of President Trump sitting in the back of the beast there, and the Secret Service will shortly open the doors for him to walk along that red carpet one final time in China, one final time for this visit. Who knows whether there might be another one. We know that they are already planning a return trip for President Xi to come to Washington in September. I believe the President Trump referenced September 24th as a potential date for that. So we will see. Obviously, a lot can happen between now and September 24th, but that appears to be on the books for both men, which, to the points that Lisa and Kyron were both making, is significant that the conversation continues. Let's just listen now as President Trump prepares to leave Beijing. So President Trump there enjoying the send-off. Those look like some of the same school children who welcomed him before, waving the flags of China and the United States. Let's bring back Jackie Heinrich, who has obviously been traveling with the president. And Jackie is not about to board Air Force One. She's got to get a good old commercial jet back home. Jackie, your thoughts as we see the president taking the final steps on this two-day summit?
Well, it seems, Jonathan, like he's really taking in the very last moments of this trip, where he was showered with a lot of shows of respect, the cultural sites he was brought to, the conversations of significance. This is, a very difficult relationship to manage with a country that his own administration calls the U.S. the greatest geopolitical adversary for the U.S. And watching him be received and sent off with this kind of fanfare is something that he very much appreciates. And I wonder also what President Xi is thinking and what he's going to be discussing with his team as he watches Air Force One take off along with the rest of us. Because on balance, it looks like Trump got what he wanted from China on this trip. It was a relationship maintenance trip in a lot of ways. Walked away with some trade deals, some more progress, drawing down this massive deficit that he started addressing in his first term. Stability for businesses. The tariff truce appears to be extended. He held firm on Taiwan, and he wasn't asking for any help from China with Iran in the first place. And I wonder what Xi is thinking China got for its part.
Yeah. And as he walks back in with a final wave there, walks into Air Force One, a final wave to those seeing him off there at the airport. I was talking with Lisa and Kyron here, Jackie, that I wonder if he's going to get in there, sit down and say, OK, Marco, OK, Pete, that was a great trip. Now, what do we do about Iran? Do you get the impression that that is going to be right back at the forefront of his mind, if indeed it ever left it?
Well, he did indicate that there may be an imminent return to kinetic action in his post on Truth Social this morning, saying that military decimation of Iran is to be continued. As you've seen, the regime refuse to agree to a deal that would limit their ability to have a nuclear weapon. And that is still a priority for him. his administration also made clear that while it was in China's interest to bring Iran to the negotiating table, the U.S. didn't have any concrete ask of them. They are handling this job quite easily themselves. And I think that they'll be discussing maybe the Iran issue, but also what they've gleaned from the Taiwan issue as well, because you saw sort of disparity in the pomp and circumstance of the show, the pageantry here, but then also contrast that with the language in the statement that came from Xi Jinping with respect to the Taiwan issue. There's a contrast there in tone, for sure.
Yeah, and it's going to be very interesting to watch now whether this package of aid to Taiwan that has been delayed a little now gets final approval. That will give us a real concrete indicator, Jackie, I guess, of whether the U.S. policy has not changed despite the fairly strong words we've heard from President Xi and other officials during this trip.
Yeah, and the Taiwanese have a domestic problem there, too. The administration has been urging them to fulfill the purchases of American armaments that their own parliament had been slow walking because it is ruled by the opposition party to the Taiwanese president. And you had American officials saying that would be a concession to China if you didn't fulfill this purchase. And that's been on the minds of the U.S. side of this thing. So I think that the president, though, making very clear that Taiwan was not up for negotiation, not even as a piece of leverage to get some help with the Iran issue, left the Chinese feeling frustrated. And you saw a warning of potential direct conflict, clashes if the Taiwan issue was not managed properly. That is what the readout said. Obviously, they did not get what they wanted from President Trump. And worth crediting him also, there were a lot of Democrats back home in America that were warning that he was going to sell out Taiwan. That did not happen.
Jackie, back to the question of Iran now, which obviously is a huge issue that President Trump still has to deal with. With your conversations at the White House, do you get any sense that there is a split there in some ways, that there are those who are saying we have to go back and finish the job militarily, and those who might be saying, no, let's keep the pressure on in terms of the blockade of the strait. Let's let them build up those oil stockpiles until they can't pump any more oil. Let the economy collapse, and then let's see where we go from there. Is there a split in the White House, or is everybody just waiting to see what the president himself wants to do?
No, I've seen everybody reading from the same sheet of music with respect to Iran. They are pretty unequivocal that there has been, they've achieved the military objectives that they laid out at the start of this war, and they're satisfied with that. There are some other issues that the president says, for instance, the nuclear dust. He told Sean Hannity, I'd feel better about it if we could get it out of there. But they really believe that time is on America's side and not on Iran's side. You heard Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, in an interview yesterday, mentioning that the U.S. believes from satellite images that Kharg Island storage is full. They're not seeing any ships move there. It's a matter of time until they'll have to shut down production. And that will cause permanent damage to Iran's military machine, because you have the illicit oil sales that fund the terror regime out of that state. They believe that time is only on their side. You also have fractured leadership in what is left of the regime, and a supreme leader who hasn't been seen in 2 months and may be badly injured or worse. So I think that there is unanimity on the part of the administration in terms of what the landscape is there. They want to see Iran agree to never have a nuclear weapon, of course, and feel that that's been achieved as well for the safety of the world. But I think the only frustration that you see from the president is when his critics say, well, don't you care about the economy? And they very, very clearly see that as Iran using what little leverage it has to manipulate domestic politics in the United States against the president and his policy toward Iran, and what he's trying to achieve with respect to keeping nuclear weapons out of their hands.
Yeah, and that certainly seems to be part of the Iranian game plan here, to try to wait out the U.S., to try to keep that economic pressure on the U.S. by causing chaos in the Strait of Hormuz, in the hope that, and you imagine that they are thinking, okay, the closer and closer we get to those midterm elections in November, the more likely that we are to get a favorable deal from President Trump, because he will be under a great deal of political pressure. But I don't know that this is a president who will cave to that kind of pressure, Jackie. What's your take on how important the looming elections are going to be in terms of what happens next, in the next few weeks, in the next few months?
I'm sure that's part of Iran's calculus. I think that they would be making a mistake to believe that domestic political pressures would drive this president to make a bad deal. I mean, this president took action on Iran that many presidents have not before, despite their repeated warnings that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. The administration points out that they had enough enriched uranium to build 11 nuclear bombs, and someone had to do something about it. And the president was not deterred by what that would look like, what that would do to the markets, and felt that this was action that he had a responsibility to take. I do think that there might be an impact on Republicans in Congress who are up for election. They might be in tougher races than they were before. It could have an impact where those Democrats who are, sort of hitting the economy line have something to hold on to, where their party does not have a message, a coherent message that they've been able to land on since the last election, which we saw an autopsy of a very, failed campaign that did not produce any sort of here's what we need to do differently. And they're hoping that they can just get by in this next election by capitalizing on people's unhappiness with their economic and financial situations. So there might be a greater impact on Republicans in Congress than the president, I think.
Yeah. Jackie, as we watch Air Force One begin to roll down the tarmac there, I know you've got a flight to catch. So if we can we see Jackie before we say goodbye to Jackie? It's been such a pleasure hosting these couple of hours with you, Jackie, and you have done such extraordinary work all week there in Beijing. I don't want to delay you and make you miss your flight, and I know you are very excited to get back to the land of the free. So bon voyage, my friend. It's been great being with you, Jackie.
Great to be with you, Jonathan, and what a historic and important visit, and what an honor to be here and to bring all of you the latest news from it. So thank you for having me, and excited to get back to the good old USA.
We are excited to have you back. Are you anchoring Sunday Briefing this week, or is it that guy Ducey?
It's Peter this weekend. It's
okay,
Peter, my
it'll be a great
this
show anyway.
I'll be watching.
Well, I hope you enjoy a wonderful weekend back home in DC, Jackie. Great being with you. Thank you so much. Bon voyage.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube, and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.